All right, in this chapter, we're going to look at the media, how it covers issues in criminal justice, and the ethical issues related to that. So most people get their knowledge of events from the media, and this is, I would say, especially true for criminal justice. People's perceptions of who are offenders, who are victims, how common certain crimes are, a lot of that comes from the news, okay? And today we have other news sources as well. So we have Twitter, we have Facebook, blogs, all kinds of other stuff. The media, though, really decides what's newsworthy, and crime ranks really high on that list. So what actually happens has really been displaced by how the media mediates that event. So media reality, right? So two things are really going to determine what the media reality of something is. So first of that is that mediated portrayal of reality, and that's fashioned by news production processes. Take, for example, today. Today is, let me see, March 13th, 2018, and we're in the middle of a blizzard and nor'easter outside. And what is the news covering? All day long, it's just snow, right? Snow, power outages, things like that. The media also sets an agenda that includes that's based on assumptions of media professionals about their audience, right? So they make assumptions about who their viewers are, and that causes them to choose some items as newsworthy and others not. And that also determines how the story is framed. So the media construction of crime includes what causes crime, what things actually are criminal, what crime control policies we should adopt. So let's take, for example, road rage. Road rage is a media construction. Media coverage also elevated the seriousness of DUI. Crime also is a form of entertainment, and in particular, this is particularly true today, right? So there's a lot of interest in true crime today, but even our fictionalized TV shows, if you think of a lot of what you see on TV, a lot of it is are crime or police procedurals. The media then also presents this image of the system as being soft on crime, that there's a lot of technicalities that free the dangerous and guilty. So what responsibilities does that media have? Claidman and Beauchamp provide a framework for discussion of this, and they're looking at the freedom of the media and whether or not that should be limited by competing moral rights. They also argue that journalists ought to make the necessary ethical decisions themselves. They do not have the absolute right to publish anything unless the courts rule otherwise. So even if they're not legally liable, they may be morally so. So there's this incident that happened where Cook, who was the author, won a Pulitzer Prize for this story that Cook wrote called Jimmy's World. And it was a story of an 8-year-old heroin addict, which later was proven to be a false story. So these two researchers and authors we just mentioned, K and B, feel that virtuous traits are especially important when stories are produced in haste and under pressure. And today, in this 24-hour news cycle and the rush to be the first person to get something out on Twitter or on your website, this really becomes an issue, and competence becomes really important. So the journalist has to separate his or her personal beliefs from the actual subject matter. So reporting the truth. K and B argue that when covering stories where the public's right to know is a determining factor, stories should be substantially complete. We want to provide the broader context. And I think that if you think about this, we often don't do this, or the media often fails to do this when it comes to crime stories. So for instance, when police shootings are covered, even if we've got 24/7 coverage of it, or we're on a channel like CNN, we often don't see anybody explaining police use of force, how it works, under what circumstances. I once heard an expert commenting in the wake of Ferguson, where the legal expert for the channel, I think it was CNN, was asked by the CNN anchor, why don't we fire warning shots? Why don't we shoot somebody in the leg? And he couldn't answer the question. And then they also didn't come back to it later on. They didn't say, okay, well, let me look into that and I'll come back and provide you that information. It should also encourage objective understanding. You should have experts from both sides, and it's best to report information that you can actually verify. And then it should be balanced and accurate. So you guys might be familiar with the Big Dance Tavern case. It's from New Bedford. The movie The Accused is based on it. If you watch the movie The Accused, it portrays the story in a little bit of a different light. So other than the 6 defendants and the victim, there were only 3 other people in the tavern at the time. But if you watch the movie or you hear some of the coverage of it, it sounds like there was a very big crowd. We also want to think about how we report on different groups of people and demographics. So there's a lot of inaccurate reporting that we see in regards to young black men. They're often portrayed as violent and menacing, and this is mostly due to the war on drugs. Even though whites are 75% of illegal drug users, that fact is very rarely reported. Orlando did some research and found that whites and blacks are depicted as criminals at similar rates. But on TV, blacks are more than twice as likely to appear as criminal suspects. In popular media, we often see whites presumed to be non-criminal by nature, so their crimes have to be explained. We often see this too in regards to sometimes terrorist events or school shootings, that when the shooter is white or the terrorist is white or the offender is white, we're often going to hear some explanations for their behavior. They have psychological issues, they're mentally ill. So there's generally this kind of law of opposites in the media where criminals and victims are portrayed in the media, usually in the complete opposite pattern of what actually happens in official statistics or victim surveys. So one way we can do this is we can conduct what's called a content analysis. Okay, content analysis looks at the way certain things are covered. And content analysis finds that crime stories are a prominent feature. I'm sure that's no surprise to anybody. They overwhelmingly focus on serious crimes against individuals, right? So those are often, they're often very heinous and concerning crimes. They're often the crimes least likely to occur. Offenders and victims are often of higher status in media stories. The risk of crime is presented as more serious. Criminal justice system is almost always represented favorably, and they're also focused, as I mentioned, on special and discrete cases. So Barack proposes a project of news-making criminology. And what they want to do is really demystify what crime and punishment is. They want to affect public attitudes in the discussion about crime, bring about policies that are based on actual analysis, allow criminologists to deploy their knowledge. We often don't see very many criminologists interviewed on TV or in the paper about things that have happened, with a few exceptions. Being in Boston, we often see the guys from Northeastern. And to call on criminologists to develop necessary media skills so that they can participate in that dialogue and help inform. Experts like criminologists are often sidelined in favor of sort of these popular narratives that argue against expertise and in favor of so-called common sense approaches. But the media is giving increasing attention to victims, and they're now a key source through which we often understand crime stories. What the media often does, though, is really perpetuate this ideal victim. The stories to which we're most sympathetic are, of course, the most sympathetic and the most, quote, innocent of victims. And the media rarely differentiates victims or provides a false, and often provides a false image of victimization and victims. So we also know that the media can engender moral panics. And if you've already taken deviance and social control, you should be familiar with this topic. So they can often take a small piece of truthful information, and then all of a sudden it explodes into this panic that these cases are everywhere, that they're, symptomatic of some, epidemic we have here. And it usually calls for then a response that's really beyond what's actually necessary. So if you've read anything about, satanic panic from the 90s, you know that there were actually no cases that have ever been verified of that. So the media also often tends to kind of cover crime as a binary issue, right? Good or evil. Criminals have no redeeming features, and victims are completely innocent. So this means we get these very simple media portrayals, right? They want you to be able to kind of take away the story in like 60 seconds. And the solutions then are often things like widespread weapon use, sophisticated technology, and heavy punishment. So, a thing that's happening in the news right now in response to these mass shootings is the argument that we should arm all the teachers. Okay, we also know that crime has become a form of infotainment, programming that's highlighting violence and aggression. And it becomes this morality tale, right? The bad guy versus the good guy. And the media also really stokes fear of crime. The more crime programming you view, the more likely you are to be fearful of crime. You often see this with people who, my Nana used to watch the news in Florida, and in Florida the news is on at like 4, 5, 6, and 7. It's literally the same 20, 30 minutes of news recycled each time. But she would then get, this idea that like different places, that were nearby that I might be going to with my cousin were suddenly very dangerous. So one thing we want to think about is what is bias and how can the media avoid it? So a bias means we're not being objective. It's a distorted, unfair judgment or disposition caused by the values of a reporter, editor, or institution. And that's different from error. Sometimes people make a mistake, right? We get bad information. Some part of the story could be omitted without a resulting bias. And being partisan isn't always necessarily a bias either. So partisanship can be justified by the story, but it leads to bias if the underlying partisan value distorts the story. News reporting involves selecting certain events and not others, and the media then decides what is newsworthy, usually based on conventional ideas about what constitutes news. So war and disasters and types of crime stories really, get ratings, right? Especially if it involves children, and especially children who are harmed or abducted by a stranger, even though those are the least likely types of, crimes to occur or the types of abductions to occur. Then that can help determine, in turn, how newsworthy something is, how police and prosecutors need to use their resources. It also sends messages about what type of behavior we think matters most in society. So think about media representations of use of force. And for those of you listening that have worked in law enforcement, I'm sure this is a huge pet peeve of yours, how this is covered in the news. So an analysis shows that about 70% of articles support the use of force as justified. The media can take something that is a bad shooting and make it look good, or they could take a good shooting and make it look bad. And some of this is just even in the word choice. Maybe they say the police fired at the victim as opposed to the victim was killed by the police. So what are the stereotypes we see of police in the media? Well, we see a professional stereotype. This is the officer who uses their power to use deadly force wisely, follows rules and regulations. Then we see the vigilante, and this is what we really kind of see in popular justice. They're welcome and ready to use deadly force against dangerous criminals. And then the oppressor, who's using legal violence to repress groups of people. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Amadou Diallo, but he was shot in 1999 19 times by the NYPD. Media accounts adopted a race angle, and there was minimal pro-police coverage for this particular case. Media and police often collaborate in making the news, so the media often seek out the police for their viewpoint of what happened, and they often accept that as though that is the correct version of what actually happened. And they often reinforce those stereotypes so that this cooperation between police and media is now a norm. Most of these stories then are sort of scaled down to omit any complexity. But for everybody who's been studying criminal justice and those of you working in the field, you know that the criminal justice system is definitely complex and crime is definitely complex. And certainly when police use force, that's a complex situation. It's a complex situation that we often view in hindsight with a lot more information than somebody has in that moment. And that piece is often missing from the broader context. So one thing we'd like the media to do is obviously avoid harm, right? We think of this when we think about medicine, but John Stuart Mill wrote about this as well. And Kant argues that we're duty-bound to give others all the respect consistent with the notion of human dignity. So we have a duty to advance the interests of others, and we should minimize harm against people. So what is harm? Well, Ross defines 7 essential duties we should exercise. They include things like keeping promises, making reparations, and expressing gratitude. And he also identified a moral duty to not injure others. So what do we mean by harm then? Is an invasion of privacy harm? For example, publishing the name of a rape victim. Acts by the media that infringe privacy must be justified as serving a vital public interest. There's been some discussion. Think about these school shootings and think about, Columbine, or think about the aftermath of the marathon bombing here in Boston. And you often see reporters going up to people and saying, like, how do you feel? Or going up to children who've been victims of crime or teenagers and, kind of asking them these intrusive questions. So we want to make sure that there's this distinction between a story being in public interest and a story that just interests the public, because we often want to know more than we probably really are entitled to know. So when harm is caused, then we have to think about what's our responsibility for that. So here's an example of a story was published of a man arrested for child molestation, and the sole evidence was the word of a 9-year-old. Not that that cannot be sufficient, but the charges were later dropped. If we were going to think about do no harm, the story, in order to publish that story, you would want more than just what the 9-year-old said. You'd want to, know, what did the police find? Is there any other evidence? So we also want to think about the media serving the public, right? So the media gets special privileges, and so they should provide public benefit, mostly timely, relevant, accurate information. But a lot of times the media becomes more concerned with rights than responsibilities. What are their rights to be able to do? If they serve the public well, that can really benefit all of us. It enhances our knowledge. It helps us understand things better. But the way we've sort of got this formula in the way we cover crime isn't necessarily helpful. We also want to think about maintaining trust. A major concern for journalism is earning and keeping the public's trust. If you are considered to be an unreliable source of news, then people won't trust you and use your information. So in a 2008 poll, they looked at the preceding 10 years, and almost every news organization had seen its credibility decline. We also want to be careful that the media should be careful not to manipulate the information, right? So manipulation is any intentional and successful influence of a person by non-coercively altering the actual choices available to the person or by non-persuasively altering others' perceptions of those choices. So journalists rely on sources who can readily use the media to promote a perspective or influence the broader public, right? We want to make sure the media should be making sure whenever they're interviewing somebody, you want to think about what is this person's angle? Is this person an expert on this subject matter? Does this person have an agenda? And that wraps up this chapter on media ethics.